Dr. Sarah Chin had always believed that humanity's greatest threat would come from climate change or nuclear war, never from the dead rising to walk among the living. As she stood in her laboratory at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta reviewing the latest reports from field teams across the southeastern United States, an uncomfortable chill ran down her spine. The morning sun streamed through the reinforced windows, casting long shadows across her cluttered desk where dozens of incident reports lay scattered like pieces of an impossible puzzle. Each report told the same terrifying story: ordinary people attacking others with unprecedented savagery, displaying superhuman strength and an apparent immunity to pain, all while exhibiting the unmistakable signs of clinical death. The victims of these attacks either died from their injuries or, more disturbingly, rose within hours to join their attackers in what could only be described as a feeding frenzy. 3 blocks away, Marcus Rodriguez was conducting his final patrol as a Georgia state trooper, though he didn't know it yet. The radio crackled with increasingly frantic dispatches from units across the city, reporting incidents that seemed to defy all logic and training. As he drove through the eerily quiet streets of downtown Atlanta, Marcus noticed something unsettling about the usual morning commute. There wasn't one. The sidewalks that should have been bustling with office workers and coffee seekers stood empty, while abandoned vehicles sat motionless in the middle of intersections. Store windows remained dark behind hastily hung closed signs, and the few people he did see moved with an urgency that spoke of barely contained panic. His radio suddenly burst to life with a call that would change everything. All units, we have a mass casualty event at Grady Hospital. Multiple fatalities, and the perpetrators appear to be the previously deceased victims from yesterday's incidents. At Grady Hospital, Dr. Michael Thompson was experiencing what he would later describe as the longest night of his medical career. The emergency department had been overwhelmed since the previous evening when the first wave of attack victims began arriving. What had started as isolated incidents of seemingly random violence had escalated into something far more sinister. The victims brought in showed bite marks, deep scratches, and signs of having been in brutal physical altercations, but their attackers defied every medical explanation. According to witnesses, these attackers moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, seemed oblivious to commands or attempts at communication, and displayed a single-minded focus on attacking any living person within reach. Even more disturbing was the fact that several of the victims who had died from their injuries during the night had somehow left their beds in the morgue, despite being declared clinically dead hours earlier. Meanwhile, in a secure bunker 50 miles north of the city, General Patricia Hayes was coordinating what had begun as a routine emergency response exercise but was rapidly becoming something unprecedented in American military history. Intelligence reports flooding in from across the region painted a picture that challenged everything she thought she knew about national security threats. This wasn't terrorism, foreign invasion, or natural disaster. This was something entirely outside the scope of traditional military planning. Satellite imagery showed crowds of people moving through urban areas in ways that defied normal human behavior patterns, gathering in increasingly large groups that seemed to move with a collective purpose toward populated areas. Communication with local law enforcement and medical facilities was becoming sporadic, and the few reports that were getting through described scenarios that sounded more like science fiction than reality. As the morning progressed, these 4 individuals, a scientist seeking answers, a police officer trying to maintain order, a doctor struggling to save lives, and a military leader preparing for the unthinkable, would find their paths converging in ways none of them could have imagined. The isolated incidents of the previous 24 hours were beginning to connect into a pattern that pointed toward a single, terrifying conclusion. Humanity was facing its first true existential threat in recorded history. The dead were not staying dead, and their numbers were growing exponentially with each passing hour. In laboratories, hospitals, police stations, and military command centers across the region, the same questions were being asked with increasing desperation. What was causing this phenomenon? How could it be stopped? And most importantly, did humanity have any chance of surviving what appeared to be the beginning of the end of the world as they knew it? The clock was ticking, and the fate of every living person on Earth hung in the balance as the ultimate battle between the living and the undead was about to begin. The first signs that something catastrophic was unfolding came through Dr. Sarah Chen's computer screen at exactly 9:47 a.m., when her epidemic modeling software began flashing urgent red alerts across a map of the southeastern United States. What had started as isolated incidents in rural Georgia was now spreading in a pattern that defied every known disease transmission model she had studied in her 15-year career. The infection rate was unlike anything in medical literature. not spreading through air or water as viruses typically did, but through direct physical contact that resulted in what could only be described as violent encounters between the infected and the healthy. Each new case created multiple additional cases within hours, creating an exponential growth curve that made her hands tremble as she traced the progression across her monitor. Phone calls from field teams were becoming increasingly desperate, with reports of entire emergency response teams going missing after responding to what should have been routine medical emergencies. The most disturbing detail in every report was the same: the infected individuals showed no response to verbal commands, displayed no recognition of friends or family members, and demonstrated a singular focus on attacking any uninfected person they encountered. Marcus Rodriguez had abandoned his patrol car 20 minutes earlier when the radio chatter became so chaotic that it was clear the normal chain of command had completely broken down. Every street seemed to lead to another scene of inexplicable violence, where groups of people who moved with an unsettling, coordinated purpose were pursuing terrified civilians through neighborhoods that had been peaceful just hours before. The attackers seemed impervious to the standard crowd control techniques he had been trained to use. They showed no fear of authority, no response to verbal warnings, and an disturbing ability to absorb physical impacts that should have incapacitated them. As he made his way on foot toward the city center, Marcus realized that the scattered reports he had been hearing on the radio were actually describing a coordinated assault on the living by what could only be the recently deceased. The bite marks on victims, the pale skin and vacant eyes of attackers, and their apparent immunity to pain all pointed to a conclusion that his rational mind refused to accept even as the evidence mounted before his eyes. Dr. Michael Thompson was barricading the emergency department doors with anything he could find when the first wave of infected individuals arrived at Grady Hospital. The medical facility that had served as a beacon of hope for the community was now under siege by former patients whose conditions had progressed far beyond anything medical science could treat. Through the reinforced glass doors, he could see dozens of figures shambling across the parking lot with the jerky, unnatural movements that had become terrifyingly familiar over the past several hours. Their clothes were torn and stained, their skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and their eyes held no trace of human intelligence or recognition. Behind him, the surviving medical staff worked frantically to establish communication with other hospitals and emergency services, only to discover that most facilities were either under similar attack or had gone completely silent. The few reports they managed to receive painted a picture of a healthcare system in complete collapse, with medical personnel either evacuating their facilities or joining the ranks of the infected after attempts to treat the mysterious condition that was spreading through the population like wildfire. General Patricia Hayes had declared a state of emergency and was mobilizing every available military unit within a 300-mile radius, but even her most experienced commanders were struggling to develop tactical responses to an enemy that operated unlike any they had encountered in their military careers. Intelligence reports indicated that the infected individuals were not acting randomly but seemed to be drawn toward areas with high concentrations of uninfected people, suggesting either some form of primitive intelligence or an instinctual behavior that made them exceptionally dangerous. Conventional weapons appeared to have limited effectiveness against the infected, with reports indicating that only severe trauma to the head seemed to permanently stop their aggressive behavior. Even more concerning was the rapid rate at which their numbers were growing. Mathematical projections suggested that if the current rate of spread continued, major population centers could be completely overrun within days rather than weeks. The general found herself facing a decision that no military leader should ever have to make: whether to authorize extreme measures to contain the outbreak, knowing that such actions could result in massive civilian casualties among both the infected and the uninfected populations caught in the affected areas. As the crisis entered its second day, the 4 individuals who had started their morning dealing with what seemed like isolated incidents now found themselves at the center of humanity's greatest survival challenge, each playing a crucial role in determining whether civilization would endure or fall to the growing army of the undead. Dr. Sarah Chen's world changed forever when the emergency broadcast system interrupted her frantic research with a message that confirmed her worst fears. Major cities across the eastern seaboard were reporting similar outbreaks, transforming what she had hoped was a localized incident into a national catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The data streaming into her laboratory painted a terrifying picture of exponential growth that suggested the infected population was doubling every 6 hours, a rate that would overwhelm every major population center within the next 72 hours if left unchecked. Her computer models indicated that traditional quarantine methods would be completely ineffective against an outbreak that spread through direct physical contact rather than airborne transmission, meaning that the infected would continue to seek out and attack healthy individuals with relentless determination. As she worked to establish communication with research facilities across the country, Sarah discovered that most of her colleagues had either evacuated their laboratories or gone silent entirely, leaving her as one of the few scientists still actively studying the phenomenon. The breakthrough came when she analyzed blood samples from infected individuals and discovered that the pathogen appeared to be rewriting the basic neural pathways in the brain, shutting down higher cognitive functions while leaving only the most primitive survival instincts intact. This explained the infected individual's single-minded focus on attacking the living and their apparent immunity to pain, fear, and rational thought. Marcus Rodriguez had linked up with a group of survivors who had taken refuge in an abandoned shopping mall, where the combination of multiple exit routes and easily defendable positions provided temporary safety from the growing hordes of infected that now roamed the streets in increasing numbers. Among the survivors were 2 other police officers, a paramedic, several retail workers who had been trapped when the outbreak began, and a handful of families with young children who looked to the uniformed officers for protection and guidance. Through broken radio communications with other survivor groups, Marcus learned that the infection was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, with reports of major highways becoming impassable due to abandoned vehicles and roaming groups of infected individuals who seemed drawn to any signs of human activity. The group's temporary sanctuary was becoming increasingly precarious as the infected gathered outside the mall in numbers that grew larger each hour, testing the barricaded entrances with a persistence that suggested they were somehow aware of the living humans sheltering inside. Marcus found himself taking on a leadership role he had never wanted, making life-and-death decisions about resource allocation, defensive strategies, and the heartbreaking question of what to do when one of their own showed signs of infection. Dr. Michael Thompson had managed to evacuate most of his surviving staff and patients to the hospital's upper floors, where they had established a makeshift medical facility and communication center that served as a vital link between scattered survivor groups throughout the city. The view from the hospital's top floor revealed the true scope of the disaster. Smoke rising from dozens of fires across the urban landscape, abandoned emergency vehicles scattered throughout the streets, and crowds of infected individuals moving through the city with the coordinated behavior of a pack hunting for prey. Through radio contact with other medical facilities, Michael learned that the infection appeared to have an incubation period of anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours, during which the victim showed no symptoms before suddenly turning violent and attacking anyone nearby. This delayed onset made it nearly impossible to identify infected individuals before they became dangerous, creating a constant state of paranoia and mistrust among survivor groups. The medical team had also discovered that the infected retained enough motor function to operate simple mechanisms like door handles and could even climb stairs, making traditional barricade strategies far less effective than initially hoped. General Patricia Hayes had made the unprecedented decision to establish martial law across the entire southeastern region while simultaneously coordinating with international allies who were reporting similar outbreaks in major cities around the world. Military units were being deployed not for conventional combat operations but for massive evacuation and containment efforts that required entirely new tactical approaches and rules of engagement. The general's biggest challenge was balancing the need to protect uninfected civilians with the growing evidence that conventional military responses were inadequate against an enemy that felt no fear, required no supplies or rest, and grew stronger with every victory. Intelligence reports suggested that the infected were somehow communicating or coordinating their movements, as large groups had been observed converging on population centers and strategic locations with a level of organization that defied their apparent lack of higher brain function. As she reviewed casualty reports and resource allocation requirements, General Hayes realized that humanity was fighting not just for survival but for the very future of civilization itself, and the outcome would be determined in the next critical hours as the living and the undead clashed in a battle that would decide the fate of the human race. Dr. Sarah Chen's breakthrough came at the worst possible moment, just as the CDC facility's backup generators began failing and the infected breached the building's outer perimeter in numbers that overwhelmed even the most pessimistic projections her computer models had generated. Her analysis of the pathogen revealed that it was unlike any naturally occurring virus or bacteria known to science, suggesting either a completely unprecedented evolutionary leap or something far more sinister in its origins. The infected weren't just mindless cannibals as initially believed, but rather were operating under a form of collective intelligence that allowed them to coordinate complex group behaviors while maintaining their relentless drive to spread the infection to every living human they encountered. As emergency lighting flickered throughout the laboratory, Sarah worked frantically to transmit her findings to military command centers and surviving research facilities around the world, knowing that her data might be humanity's only hope of developing an effective countermeasure. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the corridors as the infected finally breached the building's defenses, forcing Sarah and her remaining colleagues to retreat to the facility's secure underground bunker while uploading critical research data to satellite networks that could preserve their work even if they didn't survive the night. Through encrypted communications, she learned that similar research facilities in Europe and Asia had made comparable discoveries, suggesting that the outbreak was following identical patterns worldwide and that humanity was facing a coordinated assault on civilization itself. Marcus Rodriguez and his group of mall survivors had been forced to abandon their temporary sanctuary when the infected began working together to systematically breach their defenses, using crude tools and coordinated attacks that demonstrated a level of problem-solving ability that contradicted everything they thought they knew about the mindless nature of their enemies. The evacuation had been a harrowing journey through service tunnels and maintenance areas, with several group members lost to infected ambushes that seemed almost strategically planned to separate and isolate individual survivors. Now holed up in an abandoned warehouse district on the outskirts of the city, Marcus found himself coordinating with other survivor groups through ham radio networks that had become the primary means of communication as traditional infrastructure continued to collapse. Reports from across the region painted a picture of organized infected groups that were no longer simply wandering aimlessly but instead conducting what could only be described as military-style operations against human strongholds. The most disturbing intelligence came from a group of survivors who claimed to have observed infected individuals using simple weapons and working together to construct basic siege equipment, suggesting that whatever pathogen was driving their behavior was restoring certain cognitive abilities while eliminating others. Marcus realized that their survival strategy needed to evolve from simple defensive tactics to more sophisticated guerrilla warfare techniques if they hoped to outlast what was clearly becoming an organized campaign of extinction. Dr. Michael Thompson had transformed the hospital's upper floors into a crucial command and control center that served dozens of survivor groups throughout the metropolitan area, but maintaining their position was becoming increasingly difficult as the infected demonstrated new capabilities that made their former defensive preparations obsolete. Through medical analysis of infected blood samples and behavioral observations, his team had discovered that the pathogen appeared to be enhancing certain physical capabilities while suppressing others, resulting in infected individuals who were stronger and more resilient than normal humans but lacked emotional responses and complex reasoning abilities. The hospital's elevated position provided an excellent vantage point for observing infected group movements, and what they saw challenged every assumption about the nature of their enemy. Large groups of infected were moving through the city in coordinated formations, avoiding heavily defended areas while systematically targeting isolated survivor enclaves with precision that suggested strategic planning. Radio communications with other medical facilities revealed that infected individuals were somehow sharing information across vast distances, allowing them to respond rapidly to changes in survivor tactics and concentrate overwhelming force against human defensive positions. Dr. Thompson's medical team had also made the horrifying discovery that the infection could remain dormant in apparently healthy individuals for extended periods before activation, meaning that survivor groups might unknowingly harbor infected members who could turn at any moment and attack from within their own defensive perimeters. General Patricia Hayes had escalated the military response to include coordinated operations with international forces as reports confirmed that the outbreak had achieved global reach within less than a week of the initial incidents. Military units equipped with the most advanced weapons and equipment available were struggling against an enemy that seemed to adapt to conventional tactics with frightening speed, learning to avoid areas under heavy military control while concentrating attacks on civilian population centers that lacked adequate defenses. Intelligence analysis suggested that the infected were somehow processing and sharing tactical information, allowing them to develop counter-strategies against human military operations with an efficiency that bordered on supernatural. The general faced the impossible task of protecting millions of civilians while fighting an enemy that grew stronger with every victory and showed no signs of slowing their relentless advance toward total global dominance. Dr. Sarah Chen's desperate gamble to reach the military command center paid off when her encrypted transmission containing critical pathogen data was intercepted by General Patricia Hayes' communications team, leading to an emergency extraction mission that brought the scientist face-to-face with the full scope of humanity's coordinated resistance effort. The underground military facility buzzed with activity as personnel from every branch of the armed forces worked alongside international allies to process intelligence reports streaming in from survivor groups across the globe, revealing that the infected weren't just evolving their tactics but were somehow communicating across vast distances through methods that defied current scientific understanding. Sarah's research data provided the missing pieces to a puzzle that military strategists had been struggling to solve. The infected were operating under what could only be described as a hive mind intelligence that allowed individual groups to share tactical knowledge instantaneously, explaining their rapid adaptation to human defensive strategies and their uncanny ability to coordinate simultaneous attacks on multiple targets. As she worked with the military's top analysts to develop countermeasures based on her findings, Sarah realized that they were fighting not just an infection but an entirely new form of collective consciousness that was systematically dismantling human civilization with the efficiency of a military campaign. The breakthrough came when her analysis revealed that the pathogen required specific environmental conditions to maintain its hive-mind connections, suggesting that disrupting these conditions might fragment the infected groups and reduce their coordinated effectiveness against human settlements. Marcus Rodriguez received the military extraction coordinates through the ham radio network just as his warehouse stronghold came under the most sophisticated infected assault he had witnessed, with groups of the undead working in perfect synchronization to breach multiple entry points simultaneously while others created diversions that split the defenders' attention and resources. The rescue operation brought him and his surviving group members to a fortified military compound where he discovered that his experiences with infected tactical evolution were being replicated by survivor groups worldwide, confirming that humanity was facing an enemy that learned from every encounter and shared that knowledge across its entire population. Military briefings revealed that infected groups were no longer simply reacting to human activities but were proactively seeking out and destroying critical infrastructure, communication networks, and supply depots with targeting precision that suggested they understood the strategic importance of these facilities to human survival. Marcus found himself assigned to a special operations unit tasked with developing guerrilla warfare tactics specifically designed to exploit the few weaknesses that researchers had identified in infected group behavior, including their apparent inability to function effectively when separated from larger groups and their vulnerability to certain types of coordinated psychological warfare. The mission parameters were unlike anything in military history. Small teams of highly trained specialists would be inserted into infected-controlled territories to conduct sabotage operations against what could only be described as an alien intelligence that had taken control of human bodies and was using them as weapons in a war for planetary dominance. Dr. Michael Thompson's Hospital Command Center had become the coordination hub for an underground network of medical facilities that were working together to treat infected bite victims during the critical window before the pathogen achieved full neurological control, using experimental treatments based on Dr. Chen's research to slow or prevent the progression of the infection. The medical team's most significant discovery was that certain individuals appeared to possess natural immunity to the pathogen, opening the possibility of developing vaccines or treatments that could protect uninfected populations from future exposure. Through secure communication networks, Thompson coordinated with military medical teams to establish field hospitals and fortified positions where bite victims could receive immediate treatment, dramatically improving survival rates among civilian populations who had been exposed but not yet turned. The hospital's elevated observation post had also become a critical intelligence gathering facility, with medical staff documenting infected movement patterns and behavioral changes that provided valuable tactical information to military planning committees. Dr. Thompson's team had developed a classification system for different types of infected individuals, ranging from recently turned victims who retained some motor skills and problem-solving abilities to older infected who had lost most cognitive functions but gained enhanced strength and endurance. This research was proving crucial for military units who needed to understand the capabilities and limitations of their enemies when planning rescue operations and defensive strategies. General Patricia Hayes had consolidated surviving military forces from across the region into a coordinated command structure that was finally beginning to mount effective resistance against the infected hordes, using intelligence gathered from scientific teams and survivor groups to develop new tactical approaches that exploited the enemy's weaknesses while minimizing human casualties. The military's most successful strategy involved creating heavily fortified safe zones that could serve as bases for offensive operations while providing secure havens for civilian populations, but maintaining these positions required constant vigilance against infected groups that seemed to be developing new siege tactics with each assault. International coordination had revealed that certain geographic regions were showing higher resistance to the infection, possibly due to environmental factors or genetic variations in local populations, leading to plans for massive civilian evacuations to these relatively safe areas. The general's greatest challenge was balancing the need for immediate tactical victories against infected groups with the long-term strategic goal of preserving enough human population and infrastructure to rebuild civilization once the immediate crisis was resolved. As she reviewed global situation reports and coordinated with allied forces, General Hayes realized that the next phase of the conflict would determine whether humanity could transition from desperate survival to organized counterattack against an enemy that had claimed most of the planet in less than 2 weeks. Dr. Sarah Chen's modified pathogen countermeasure was deployed across the first test zone at dawn, as military units coordinated the largest offensive operation against infected territories since the outbreak began, targeting a heavily populated metropolitan area where the hive mind concentration appeared to be strongest based on her research data. The experimental weapon worked by disrupting the electromagnetic frequencies that her team had identified as the communication medium between infected individuals, theoretically fragmenting their collective intelligence and reducing them to the mindless, uncoordinated state that military forces were better equipped to handle. Initial reports from the field teams were promising. Infected groups that had been moving in perfect synchronization suddenly began wandering aimlessly, attacking each other as often as they pursued human targets, and failing to coordinate the sophisticated defensive strategies that had made previous military operations so costly. However, Sarah's monitoring equipment detected troubling anomalies in the pathogen's behavior patterns, suggesting that the hive mind was adapting to the countermeasure far more rapidly than her models had predicted, with some infected groups appearing to develop immunity to the disruption effects within hours of exposure. As she worked frantically to modify the countermeasure frequency, Sarah realized that they were engaged in a technological arms race with an intelligence that could evolve and adapt its defenses faster than human science could develop new weapons, forcing her to consider increasingly desperate measures that might permanently damage the infected neural networks but could also affect uninfected humans in unpredictable ways. Marcus Rodriguez led his special operations team through the ruins of downtown Atlanta, where the temporary success of Dr. Chen's countermeasure had created a narrow window of opportunity to rescue trapped civilian populations and destroy critical infected infrastructure before the hive mind could re-establish its control over the area. The urban landscape had been transformed into something from a nightmare, with infected bodies littering the streets in the aftermath of their confused self-destructive behavior, while survivors emerged from hidden refuges to assist with the evacuation efforts that could save thousands of lives if completed before the countermeasure effects wore off. Marcus's team had been tasked with reaching the city's main communication center, where intelligence suggested the infected had been using human technology to amplify their hive mind signals, creating regional coordination nodes that allowed them to manage large-scale operations across vast territories. The mission required navigating through territories where confused infected groups still posed significant dangers, while also racing against time to complete their objectives before the pathogen's adaptation process restored the enemy's tactical coordination. Through tactical communications, Marcus learned that similar operations were being conducted simultaneously in major cities around the world, representing humanity's first coordinated global offensive against the infected territories and the best chance they might have to reclaim significant population centers before the enemy's numerical advantage became completely overwhelming. Dr. Michael Thompson had transformed his hospital facility into a major field medical center supporting the offensive operations, treating not only bite victims and combat casualties but also conducting rapid analysis of infected biological samples to track the pathogen's adaptation process in real time. His medical teams had developed procedures for safely handling infected prisoners who had been captured during the confused state caused by the countermeasure, allowing researchers to study the pathogen's behavior patterns and potentially develop more permanent solutions to the hive mind problem. The hospital's communication center had become a crucial link in the military's intelligence network, processing field reports from combat units and civilian rescue teams while coordinating medical evacuations and supply distributions across the expanding safe zones. Dr. Thompson's most significant contribution to the offensive was his development of rapid-response medical protocols that could treat pathogen exposure within minutes rather than hours, dramatically increasing survival rates among military personnel and civilian volunteers who were essential to the operation's success. Through his coordination with other medical facilities, Thompson learned that the countermeasure was having unexpected positive effects on recently infected individuals, with some patients showing signs of recovering their human consciousness even after the pathogen had achieved partial neurological control, suggesting that the window for successful treatment might be much longer than previously believed. General Patricia Hayes coordinated the massive multi-front offensive from her command center, where real-time satellite imagery and field reports painted a picture of the largest military operation in human history as forces from dozens of nations worked together to reclaim infected territories while the countermeasure temporarily disrupted enemy coordination. The operation required precise timing and flawless execution, with civilian evacuation efforts, military strikes against infected strongholds, and scientific research missions all proceeding simultaneously across multiple time zones and geographic regions. Early reports indicated that the offensive was achieving its primary objectives, with significant infected populations neutralized and major population centers successfully liberated, but the general's biggest concern was the intelligence indicating that the pathogen was adapting to human tactics even faster than expected. Military analysts were detecting signs that some infected groups had retained their coordination abilities despite the countermeasure, suggesting that the hive mind was developing immunity to human technological interference and might soon regain full tactical control over its scattered forces. As she monitored the global situation, General Hayes realized that this offensive represented humanity's best opportunity to achieve decisive victory against the infected, but failure would likely result in facing an enemy that had learned from human tactics and become virtually impossible to defeat through conventional military means. The next 12 hours would determine whether humanity could transition from desperate survival to victorious reconquest, or whether they would find themselves facing an adapted enemy that was immune to their most effective weapons. Dr. Sarah Chin watched in horror as her monitoring systems registered the complete failure of the countermeasure across all global deployment zones, with infected groups not only regaining their hive mind coordination but demonstrating enhanced tactical capabilities that suggested the pathogen had used the disruption period to evolve beyond its previous limitations. The temporary fragmentation of the infected forces had been a trap, allowing the hive mind to analyze human technological capabilities and develop permanent immunity to electromagnetic interference while simultaneously studying military tactics employed during the offensive operations. Reports flooded in from field teams around the world describing infected groups that moved with military precision, using captured human equipment and demonstrating strategic thinking that surpassed anything they had displayed before the countermeasure deployment. Sarah's worst fears were confirmed when her analysis revealed that the pathogen had not only adapted to human weapons but had begun modifying the neural networks of infected individuals to create specialized roles within their society: strategic coordinators with enhanced cognitive abilities, physical specialists with improved strength and speed, and technical operators capable of using complex human technology. As emergency sirens wailed throughout the military facility, Sarah realized that humanity's greatest scientific achievement had inadvertently accelerated the enemy's evolution, transforming a manageable threat into an existential crisis that threatened to overwhelm all remaining human defenses within days rather than weeks. Marcus Rodriguez and his special operations team found themselves trapped deep in enemy territory when the infected forces regained coordination and immediately launched what could only be described as a perfectly executed counteroffensive that demonstrated tactical sophistication rivaling the best human military strategists. The mission to destroy the communication center had been partially successful, but the infected had apparently anticipated the attack and used it as an opportunity to study human special forces tactics while allowing their enemies to penetrate deep into territory that was now completely cut off from friendly forces. Marcus's team was forced to fight a running battle through urban terrain where every street corner could conceal infected ambushes that seemed to predict their movements with uncanny accuracy, while overhead surveillance showed massive infected armies converging on their position from all directions. Radio communications with military command revealed that similar trap scenarios were playing out across the globe, with special forces units and rescue teams finding themselves surrounded by enemies who had learned to exploit human tactical doctrines and turn them into vulnerabilities. The infected forces were no longer simply defending their territory but were conducting coordinated offensive operations designed to capture rather than kill human military personnel, suggesting they were gathering intelligence about human capabilities and weaknesses for use in future operations. As his team sought shelter in an abandoned subway system, Marcus realized that they were no longer fighting mindless zombies but were engaged in asymmetric warfare against an intelligence that had access to all human knowledge while possessing capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. Dr. Michael Thompson's hospital command center became the focal point for coordinating humanity's desperate last stand as infected forces launched simultaneous assaults on every major safe zone and military facility across the planet, demonstrating a level of global coordination that proved the hive mind had achieved true planetary consciousness. The medical facility's defensive preparations, which had seemed adequate against previous infected attacks, were quickly overwhelmed by enemies who employed siege warfare tactics that systematically neutralized human advantages while minimizing their own casualties. Thompson's medical teams worked frantically to treat casualties from the collapsing military operations while also attempting to evacuate critical research data and civilian populations to fallback positions that might provide temporary refuge from the advancing infected armies. Through his coordination with other medical facilities, Thompson discovered that the infected were specifically targeting medical personnel and research facilities, apparently recognizing that human scientific capabilities represented the greatest long-term threat to their dominance. The hospital's communication systems registered final transmissions from medical facilities around the world as they fell to coordinated infected assaults, leaving Thompson's team as one of the last remaining centers of organized medical resistance against an enemy that was systematically dismantling human civilization's infrastructure. As infected forces breached the hospital's outer defenses, Thompson made the crucial decision to transmit all remaining medical research to hidden backup facilities while preparing for a final stand that would determine whether human medical knowledge would survive the collapse of organized society. General Patricia Hayes faced the ultimate command decision as reports confirmed that every major military operation worldwide had failed catastrophically, with human forces either destroyed or captured by infected armies that demonstrated tactical superiority in every engagement. The coordinated global offensive that had represented humanity's best hope for victory had instead provided the enemy with detailed intelligence about human capabilities while allowing them to test their own evolved abilities against the most advanced military technology available. Satellite surveillance showed infected forces massing for final assaults on the remaining human strongholds, with troop movements that displayed strategic planning capabilities that exceeded those of most human military commanders. The general's communication with Allied forces around the world painted a picture of complete military collapse, with only scattered pockets of human resistance remaining in heavily fortified positions that were unlikely to withstand sustained assault by the enhanced infected forces. As she prepared to implement humanity's final contingency plans, General Hayes realized that conventional military victory was no longer possible and that survival would depend on radical strategies that might preserve some remnant of human civilization through the coming darkness that threatened to engulf the entire planet. Dr. Sarah Chen's final gambit emerged from the ashes of her failed countermeasure as she realized that the pathogen's rapid evolution had created an unexpected vulnerability. Its enhanced complexity required exponentially more energy to maintain the hive-mind connections, making it dependent on specific biological and environmental conditions that could be systematically disrupted through coordinated strikes against the infected power infrastructure. Working feverishly in the underground bunker as infected forces overran the facility above, Sarah transmitted the coordinates for a network of biological relay points that the evolved pathogen was using to maintain global coordination, realizing that destroying these nodes simultaneously might fragment the hive mind permanently rather than temporarily. The plan required precise timing and would demand the sacrifice of every remaining human military unit in coordinated suicide missions, but computer models suggested it represented humanity's only remaining chance to reduce the infected forces back to manageable, uncoordinated groups that scattered survivor populations might eventually overcome. As explosions echoed through the facility and infected forces breached the bunker's final defenses, Sarah completed her transmission to every surviving military command center while activating a localized electromagnetic pulse that would destroy all research equipment but buy precious seconds for her data to reach the teams that could implement her desperate strategy. Marcus Rodriguez received Dr. Chen's final transmission just as his trapped Special Forces team discovered that their subway refuge connected to a network of underground maintenance tunnels that could provide access to one of the critical biological relay nodes located beneath the city's main power grid. The mission had transformed from escape and survival to a final strike operation that could contribute to humanity's last coordinated offensive against the hive mind infrastructure, even though success would likely mean certain death for everyone involved in the assault. Marcus led his team through the tunnel network while coordinating with other trapped military units around the world who had received similar targeting information, realizing that hundreds of small teams were simultaneously converging on relay nodes in a desperate attempt to achieve strategic victory through tactical sacrifice. The underground approach allowed them to avoid the massive infected armies on the surface while reaching their target, but the relay node was defended by infected individuals who demonstrated cognitive abilities far beyond anything they had encountered before, suggesting that the hive mind had concentrated its most evolved specimens to protect its critical infrastructure. As his team prepared their final assault, Marcus understood that they were fighting not just for their own survival but for every human being who might live to see tomorrow, and that their sacrifice could determine whether humanity would face extinction or find a path back from the brink of total defeat. Dr. Michael Thompson coordinated the evacuation of critical medical research and civilian populations to hidden underground facilities while his hospital came under final assault by infected forces that seemed determined to capture rather than destroy the remaining medical personnel and equipment. The systematic nature of the infected attack confirmed Sarah Chen's theory that the hive mind recognized human medical knowledge as a strategic threat that needed to be controlled rather than eliminated, providing Thompson with the insight needed to implement a scorched earth strategy that would deny the enemy access to advanced medical technology and research data. His medical teams worked to establish autonomous treatment centers in hidden locations where surviving humans could receive care without depending on centralized facilities that were vulnerable to infected assault, while also creating encrypted databases that could preserve medical knowledge through whatever chaos was about to engulf the world. As infected forces breached the hospital's final defenses, Thompson transmitted activation codes for hidden medical facilities across the region while destroying all remaining research equipment, ensuring that human medical capabilities would survive even if organized medical institutions did not. The final transmission from his facility contained treatment protocols for pathogen exposure and infection management that could allow small survivor groups to maintain their health and resistance capabilities during the long struggle that lay ahead. General Patricia Hayes coordinated humanity's final coordinated military operation from her deep underground command center as reports confirmed that scattered military units around the world were successfully striking biological relay nodes simultaneously, causing massive disruptions in infected coordination networks and fragmenting the hive mind into isolated regional groups that lost their strategic coordination capabilities. The sacrifice of remaining military forces achieved the strategic objective that conventional warfare had failed to accomplish, reducing the evolved infected forces back to manageable local threats that survivor communities might eventually overcome through guerrilla warfare and attrition tactics. Satellite surveillance showed confused infected groups wandering aimlessly as their hive mind connections severed, while human survivor populations emerged from hidden refuges to begin the long process of reclaiming their world one small area at a time. The general's final orders established protocols for rebuilding human civilization from scattered survivor communities, with emphasis on maintaining technological capabilities and coordinated resistance networks that could prevent the infected from re-establishing global coordination. As her facility prepared for final evacuation to deep shelter positions, General Hayes transmitted activation codes for hidden supply caches and weapons stockpiles that would support survivor communities during the decades of struggle required to fully reclaim the planet from the fragmented infected populations. Her last official act was commissioning the survivors to carry forward the mission of human civilization, ensuring that the species would endure and eventually triumph over the darkness that had nearly consumed their world, emerging stronger and more united than ever before in their long history of survival against impossible odds.